The morning Soriel lost everything. The bread was still warm in her hands. She stood at the edge of the royal courtyard, the same spot she had occupied every dawn for 2 years, her wooden cart loaded with fresh loaves for the palace stables. Flour dusted her sleeves. The scent of rosemary and oat clung to her hair. And through the open gates of the grand terrace, she watched the man she loved bind himself to another woman. The sundering rite. An alpha king, upon reaching his 30th year, was required to select a bonded consort before the assembled lords of every territory. The rite could not be postponed, it could not be refused. And once the words were spoken beneath the iron antlers of the ancestor throne, the bond was considered unbreakable. Soriel had known this day was coming. Callan had warned her, lying beside her in the hidden root cellar beneath the eastern paddock, his fingers tracing slow circles on her bare shoulder, while moonlight leaked through the floorboards above. "It is a formality," he had murmured against her temple. "A political performance. The consort rite means nothing compared to what exists between us." "Then why can you not choose me?" she had asked, though she already knew the answer. "Because you are not of noble blood. The council would never accept it. But I swear to you, Soriel, on the mark I have given you, that no woman will ever hold what you hold. When the rite is done, I will find a way. I will change the laws if I must." She had believed him, not because his words were pretty, but because the claiming mark he had placed on the inside of her left wrist burned with a heat that matched the conviction in his amber eyes. A secret mark, hidden beneath the leather wrap she wore every day, invisible to everyone but the two of them. Now she stood in the courtyard with flour on her hands and watched the conviction die. The terrace was crowded with hundreds of noble wolves. Banners of crimson and iron gray hung from the stone columns. The High Warden recited the rites in a voice that carried across the still morning air, and Callan stood at the center of it all, dressed in the black and silver of his bloodline, his broad chest crossed with the ceremonial sash of kingship. The eyes that had once looked at her as if she contained every star in the firmament were empty now. Soriel gripped the edge of her cart. Her knuckles whitened around the rough wood. Something was wrong. She could see it in the way he moved. Too stiff, too measured. As if his body were a marionette being guided by strings she could not see. The 5 candidates ascended the terrace steps in their ceremonial white. Daughters of the great houses, every one of them groomed for this moment since birth. And at the front, tall and sharp-featured, with hair the color of dark wine and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, walked Revka of House Soranthal. The Soranthals controlled the western mountain passes and commanded the largest standing army outside the crown's own forces. Their daughter had been promised to this moment for a decade. Soriel's mark burned beneath its leather binding, a deep, searing pulse that made her bite her lip to keep from crying out. "Look at me," she thought desperately. "Look this way. Find me. Remember what you promised." Callan did not look. "Callan, Alpha King of Cathara, blood of the founding pack," the High Warden intoned. "You stand before the assembled lords. Name your consort." The silence that followed was the longest of Soriel's life. She watched his throat move, watched his hands clench at his sides, then relax with mechanical precision. Watched the muscles in his jaw tighten and release, as if he were fighting something deep inside himself and losing. "I name," he said, and his voice sounded like it belonged to a dead man. "Revka of House Soranthal." The terrace erupted in celebration. Wolves howled. Lords embraced. Warriors stamped the stone in approval. And in the courtyard below, unseen and unheard, Soriel felt the warm loaves tumble from her numb fingers and scatter across the cobblestones. The mark on her wrist did not fade. It screamed. White-hot agony ripped up her arm and buried itself in her chest. She doubled over against the cart, a strangled sound escaping her throat that was swallowed by the noise above. Her vision blurred. Her knees struck the ground beside the fallen bread, and she knelt there in the dirt, one hand clamped over her wrist, watching through tear-streaked eyes as Callan took Revka's hand and raised it to the cheering crowd. He did not flinch. He did not search the courtyard. He did not look like a man who remembered that a baker's daughter carried his mark on her skin and his secret in her blood. Her other hand pressed flat against her stomach. 8 weeks. She had counted the days with terrified precision. 8 weeks since the night in the root cellar when the bond between them had deepened into something that left consequences. She had planned to tell him today, after the rite, when he came to her as he always did, slipping through the stable shadows with that crooked half-smile she had never been able to resist. Now he stood on the terrace with another woman's hand in his, and the words she had rehearsed turned to ash in her mouth. Soriel gathered the fallen loaves with shaking hands and placed them back in the cart, one by one, because she did not know what else to do. Then she pushed her cart toward the stables, delivered the bread as she did every morning, and walked back to her small bakery without a single person noticing that the world had ended. No one saw her leave. No one heard the howl that split the dawn sky 20 minutes later, rising from the grand terrace with a grief so raw that wolves across the city stopped in their tracks and whimpered. And no one saw the Alpha King stagger to the edge of the terrace, his eyes suddenly wild and blazing, his hands gripping the stone rail as he stared down at the empty courtyard where a scattering of flour and breadcrumbs was the only proof that she had ever been there at all. It had begun with bread. 7 months before the sundering rite, Soriel had been delivering the dawn loaves to the royal stables, as she had done since her grandmother died and left her the bakery. It was simple work, honest work. She arrived before sunrise, stacked the loaves in the stable kitchen for the grooms and handlers, and left before the palace stirred to life. She never lingered. She never looked up at the palace windows. She never gave anyone a reason to notice her. That was the rule her grandmother had drilled into her since childhood. Keep your head down. Keep your gift hidden. A common blood wolf with healing hands is a curiosity. A common blood wolf who can mend bone and close wounds with a touch is a threat. So Soriel kept her head down. She baked bread. She healed no one. And she never, ever looked at the wolves who outranked her. Because meeting the gaze of an alpha was a challenge, and challenges invited attention, and attention invited discovery. She had followed this rule perfectly for 2 years, until the morning the Alpha King's warhorse threw a shoe and gashed its foreleg on the stable gate. The grooms had panicked. The horse was Callan's personal mount, a massive black stallion worth more than every building on Soriel Street combined. Blood poured from a wound that would take weeks to heal and might leave the animal lame. Soriel had not thought. She had simply acted. Her hands found the wound, and the warmth that lived in her palms flowed outward before she could stop it. The flesh knit together beneath her fingers. The bleeding stopped. The stallion quieted, pressing its great head against her chest with a sigh of relief. When she looked up, Callan was standing in the stable doorway. He had watched the entire thing. "You healed him," the Alpha King said. Not a question. Soriel's blood froze. "I did not mean to. Please, my lord, Why do you never look at me?" The question startled her into silence. Of all the things she had expected, an accusation of witchcraft, a demand for explanation, a command to leave, that was not one of them. "I deliver bread," she managed. "I am no one." "You are someone who just healed a wound that would have taken my best physician a fortnight to close." He stepped closer. "And you are someone who has walked through my stables every morning for 2 years without once raising her eyes above the ground. I have noticed, Soriel. I have noticed every single morning." He knew her name. The Alpha King of Cathara knew the name of the baker who delivered bread to his stables. That was the beginning. What followed was 7 months of stolen hours. He came to her bakery after dark. She learned that he hated wine, but drank it because the council expected it. He learned that she sang to the bread dough while it rose because her grandmother swore it made the crust better. He told her about the suffocating weight of the crown. She told him about the gift she had hidden her entire life. The claiming mark came on a night in midwinter. He pressed his mouth to the inside of her wrist, and his teeth broke the skin with a gentleness that made her weep. "You are my mate," he said against her pulse. "The bond chose you. I chose you. And when the time is right, the kingdom will know." She had wrapped the mark in leather the next morning and told no one. Soriel did not return to the stables the next morning. She rose before dawn out of habit, her body moving through the familiar motions of measuring flour and stoking the oven before her mind caught up and reminded her that everything was different now. The dough she had set to rise the night before sat untouched in its bowl, swollen and sour from neglect. She stared at it for a long time. Then she dumped it in the waste bin, locked the bakery door, and began to pack. The mark on her wrist throbbed with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. It should have been fading. When an alpha chose a consort through the sundering rite, any prior claim was supposed to dissolve. The old bond withered so the new one could take root. That was the law of wolf blood, as immutable as the turning of seasons. But her mark was not fading. If anything, it burned brighter, hotter, a brand pressed fresh against her skin every few seconds. And through it, she felt something she could not explain. A pulling, a reaching, as if something on the other end of an invisible thread was clawing its way toward her. Soriel shoved the sensation down. She could not afford false hope. She had seen it with her own eyes, had watched him speak the words, had watched him take Revka's hand and present her to the kingdom as his chosen. Whatever she had felt through the mark was an echo, a ghost of something that no longer existed. She packed only what she could carry: 2 changes of clothes, the copper mixing bowl her grandmother had used for 40 years, a small purse of coins from beneath the hearthstone, a bundle of dried herbs for the morning nausea. The bakery she left unlocked. Someone would claim it within a week. She paused at the back door, her hand on the latch. Through the narrow window above the kneading table, she could see the palace rising against the pale sky. Torches still blazed along the terrace where the sundering rite had been celebrated hours earlier. Somewhere inside those walls, Callan was beginning his new life with his new consort. And somewhere inside her own body, his child was beginning its life too. "I will not raise you in a place where your father chose someone else," she whispered to the flatness of her belly. "I will not teach you to keep your head down and hide what you are. You deserve more than shadows." She pulled the leather wrap from her wrist and looked at the mark one final time. It glowed faintly in the pre-dawn dark, a crescent of teeth marks that pulsed with amber light. Beautiful. Agonizing. Soriel pressed her lips to it. "I release you," she said. The words were ceremonial, the traditional severance spoken by a rejected mate. They were supposed to dissolve the bond entirely, freeing both parties. The mark flared white-hot. Soriel cried out, bracing herself against the doorframe as pain radiated from her wrist to her shoulder. She waited for the relief that was supposed to follow, the numbing calm of a severed bond. It never came. The mark dimmed, but did not disappear. The pull in her chest weakened, but did not break. The thread between them stretched thin as spider silk, but held. The bond refused to die. Soriel did not have time to wonder what that meant. She shouldered her pack, pulled her cloak tight around her, and slipped into the last darkness before dawn. She did not see the figure that dropped from the palace wall 3 streets behind her, moving with the desperate speed of a wolf on the edge of madness. She did not hear the sound of claws scraping cobblestone as a massive black wolf skidded around the corner of her empty bakery, its nose pressed to the ground, following a scent that was already dissolving in the morning rain. And she did not know that the rain, which began to fall in heavy sheets moments after she passed through the city's southern gate, was the only reason the Alpha King lost her trail. By the time the sun rose over Cathara, Soriel was gone, and the bread cart sat abandoned in the royal stables, its last delivery already going stale. 4 months later, the fishing village of Dunhallow knew Soriel only as Wren. She had chosen the name because it was small and plain and forgettable. She had chosen Dunhallow for similar reasons. It sat on the northern coast, as far from the capital as the kingdom's borders allowed, a place where salt wind scoured the cliffs, and the nearest road of any consequence was a 2-day ride south. The village elder, a grizzled old wolf named Harsk, had taken one look at her swollen belly and wind-burned face, and asked no questions. He gave her the empty cottage above the smokehouse in exchange for bread. Bread, it turned out, was the one thing Dunhallow lacked. The nearest mill was 40 miles inland, and the last baker had died 2 winters past. The villagers had been surviving on flat cakes cooked on hearthstones, dense and tasteless, and nothing like the golden-crusted loaves Soriel pulled from her small clay oven each morning. Within a week, she was indispensable. She baked from midnight to dawn, the rhythm of kneading and shaping grounding her when grief threatened to pull her under. The work was familiar. The heat of the oven was familiar. And if she sometimes caught herself humming the songs her grandmother had taught her, the ones that made the crust crack just right, she could pretend for a few hours that her life had not been gutted to the foundations. The days she could manage. It was the nights that nearly destroyed her. The mark on her wrist had settled into a persistent low burn that flared without warning, waking her with a heat so fierce she had to press it against the cold stone wall. And with the heat came a constant, directional tug in her chest, pulling south, toward Cathara, toward him. He was searching. Soriel refused to let herself think about it. She had spoken the severance words. She had walked away. He had a consort now. He would move on. The baby disagreed. Every night when the mark burned, the child inside her stirred with a forceful urgency, as if responding to a voice only it could hear. The village midwife, a cheerful woman named Dala, had measured Soriel's belly during her last visit and gone quiet for several seconds. "You are large for 6 months," Dala said carefully. "My grandmother was a broad woman." "Mmm." Dala pressed her hands to different spots. "I feel a head here, and something that might be another head here." She looked up. "Wren, I think you may be carrying twins." Soriel's heart had stopped. Twins were rare among wolves. Rare and significant. In the old bloodlines, twin births were said to occur only when a true mate bond was involved, when the connection between parents ran so deep that the children born from it arrived in pairs, each one carrying a different facet of their parents' combined gifts. Common wolves did not produce twins, fated mates did. "I am sure it is just the one," Soriel had said, her voice perfectly steady. "Perhaps a large one. My appetite has been considerable." Dalla had let it go, but Soriel had lain awake that night with both hands on her belly, feeling the dual rhythms of 2 tiny heartbeats beneath her palms, and understood with terrible clarity that the evidence of what she was to Callan was growing inside her in a form she could not hide. She pulled the leather tighter over her mark each morning. She baked her bread. She pretended to be exactly what she claimed: a widow, a nobody, a woman with no past worth mentioning. But the pull in her chest grew stronger every day, and the dreams had started. Soriel could not call them nightmares, because nightmares did not leave her aching with longing when she woke. In them, she stood in her old bakery, flour on her hands, and Callan was there. Not the hollow puppet from the sundering right, the real Callan. The one who leaned against her kneading table and stole pieces of raw dough when he thought she was not looking. The one whose amber eyes crinkled at the corners when she scolded him for it. In the dreams, he spoke to her. The same words. Every time. "I am coming. Wait for me. Please, Soriel. Wait." She woke every morning with his voice still ringing in her ears and the taste of bread flour on her tongue. She told herself it meant nothing. She almost believed it. The traders arrived in Dunhallow on a gray afternoon in late spring, their cart rattling down the coastal road with a load of iron nails and salted pork and news from the south. Soriel was pulling the last loaves from the oven when young Pella, the harbor master's daughter, burst through the bakery door with color high in her cheeks and words tumbling out faster than sense. "Wren, have you heard? The traders. They say the kingdom is falling apart." Soriel set the bread paddle down with deliberate care. Kingdoms are always falling apart according to traders. It makes their goods seem more valuable. "No, this is real." Pella leaned against the counter, breathless. "They say the Alpha King has lost his mind. He has emptied the royal treasury offering bounties. The Western lords are threatening to break away because the crown's wolves keep tearing through their territories, searching every village from the mountains to the sea." Soriel's hands went still. Searching for what? For someone. A woman. No one knows who she is. They say he has not slept since the Sundering Rite. They say his wolf is taking over, that he shifts without warning, that his own council is afraid to be in the same hall with him. The mark beneath Soriel's leather wrap pulsed. She pressed her wrist against her hip. "Crops are failing in the southern provinces," Pella continued. "The herds have scattered. Even the wild wolves have gone strange. They say it is because the king's bond is broken, and when an alpha's bond breaks, the land feels it." Soriel knew this. An alpha's bond was not merely personal, it was the living link that kept the natural order stable. A bond trapped in the agony of incompletion would slowly poison everything it touched. "They are offering 15,000 gold pieces," Pella said. "For any information about the woman." 15,000 Ren. Can you imagine? Soriel could imagine it with the sickening precision of someone who understood exactly what was happening. "The affairs of kings are no concern of ours," she said quietly. Pella left, still buzzing with the thrill of distant drama. Soriel locked the bakery door, sank to the flour-dusted floor, and pressed both hands against her belly. He was searching. Not casually, not quietly. He was dismantling his own kingdom to find her. A king did not do that for a discarded lover. A king did not empty his treasury and terrify his own lords for a woman he had willingly replaced, unless he had not been willing at all. The thought surfaced like a bubble from deep water, and Soriel shoved it back down with the strength of long practice. She could not afford it. Hope was a blade that cut from both directions, and she had already bled enough. But that night, the dream came again. Callan in her bakery. Flour on his hands, his eyes burning amber in the dark. "I am closer now," he said. "Do not run again. Please. I cannot survive losing you twice." Soriel woke with tears on her face and the twin heartbeats drumming against her palms. The pull in her chest had shifted direction. He was coming from the south now. He was close. 3 days after the traders left, the wolves appeared. Soriel spotted them at dawn while carrying the first batch of loaves down the cliff path to the smokehouse. 3 shapes on the ridge above the village, motionless against the gray sky. They were too large to be wild wolves and too still to be anything but watchers. Her blood turned cold. She delivered the bread with steady hands, returned to her bakery, and bolted the door. Through the salt-crusted window she could see the ridge. The wolves had not moved. They were waiting. An hour passed. 2. Soriel worked the dough with mechanical precision, her mind racing through options she already knew were useless. Dunhallow had no walls, no garrison, no place to hide that a wolf's nose could not find. She was trapped. The knock came just after midday. It was polite, measured. 3 deliberate raps that somehow conveyed both authority and restraint. Soriel picked up the iron bread peel, the heaviest tool she owned, and approached the door. The man who stood on her threshold was lean rather than massive, with close-cropped gray hair and a weathered face. His pale amber eyes moved over her with the quick assessment of someone who had been searching for a very long time. Behind him stood two younger wolves in traveling leathers, their postures rigid with the discipline of trained soldiers. "Mistress Wren," the gray-haired man said, "who is asking?" "My name is Thormund. I serve as first shield to the Alpha King." He paused. "May I speak with you privately? What I have to say is not meant for the street." "I am a baker," Soriel said flatly. "Whatever business the Alpha King has, it is not with me." Thormund's expression shifted. Something moved behind those pale eyes, something that looked like exhaustion mixed with fragile, hard-won relief. "My lady," he said softly, and the title landed like a stone in still water. "I have walked through 47 villages in 4 months. I have knocked on more doors than I can count. I have shown your description to every innkeeper, every midwife, every merchant between the capital and the northern coast." His voice dropped. "I know who you are. I know what you carry. And I know that the mark on your left wrist is still burning, because the one who gave it to you has not stopped reaching for you since the moment you disappeared." Soriel's grip tightened on the bread peel. Her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her teeth. "You are mistaken," she said. "I am not." Thormund reached into his coat and withdrew a small object. He held it out on his open palm. It was a piece of bread crust, dried and cracked and clearly months old, but Soriel recognized it instantly. The particular golden color of her rosemary oat loaves, the distinctive pattern of her grandmother's scoring knife. "He carries this in his pocket," Thormund said. "It is the last piece of bread you delivered to the stables. He will not let anyone touch it. He will not let anyone throw it away." The first shield's voice roughened. "It is the only thing that calms his wolf when the madness takes him." Soriel's vision blurred. She blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. "Why are you here?" she whispered. "Because the king did not choose Revka willingly." The world tilted. Soriel's hand found the doorframe, and she held on. "The night before the sundering rite," Thormund continued, "someone introduced a compound into the king's evening meal. We believe it was a derivative of moonsbane, a root that suppresses the wolf entirely. It severs the animal from the conscious mind. It breaks the connection to instinct, to emotion, to the mate bond itself." "That is a myth," Soriel breathed. "Moonsbane has not been used in centuries." "House Sorenthal has had centuries to cultivate it." Thormund's jaw tightened. "The compound was undetectable in food. The king consumed it unknowingly. By the time the sundering rite began the next morning, he was operating on nothing but surface cognition. No wolf, no bond, no awareness of what he was truly doing." "He spoke the words," Soriel said, her voice cracking. "He took her hand. I saw him." "You saw a body performing a ceremony while the man inside it was locked in a cage he did not know existed." Thormund stepped closer. "The effects lasted 72 hours. When they wore off, the king woke in his chambers with Revka beside him and no memory of anything after his evening meal 3 days prior. The first word he spoke was your name." Soriel's knees gave way. Thormund caught her elbow and guided her to the chair beside the hearth. He knelt before her, his weathered face level with hers. "He tore the chambers apart looking for you," the first shield said quietly. "When he found your bakery empty, he shifted and ran through the city in the rain, following your scent until it dissolved. He has not fully returned to himself since that morning." The leather wrap on Soriel's wrist had loosened during the exchange. The mark glowed faintly in the dim bakery, pulsing with amber light. Thormund looked at it. His expression crumbled. "It is still active," he said, almost to himself. "After 4 months. After the severance words." He looked up at her. "My lady, a bond that survives the severance rite has not existed in recorded history. What you share with the king is something none of us fully understand." Before Soriel could respond, Thormund reached into his coat again. This time, he withdrew a folded letter sealed with dark red wax. We intercepted this from a Saranthal courier 2 weeks ago, he said. I need you to read it. Soriel broke the seal with numb fingers. The letter was 3 lines. The baker has been located in a northern coastal village. Disposal has been contracted. The matter will be resolved before midsummer. Cathara endures under its true queen. Soriel read the words twice. The second time, her hand moved to her belly, where both babies kicked in sharp, simultaneous protest. Disposal, she repeated. The word tasted like iron. Assassins, Thormund confirmed. We do not know how many or how close. Then you should not have come here, Soriel said fiercely. If they are watching, you have confirmed exactly where I am. Which is why we must move quickly. The king is 3 days behind me. The bond is guiding him north. He will find Dunhallow with or without my help. The first shield paused. But the assassins may find you first. As if summoned by his words, Soriel's mark erupted with a heat so intense that golden light spilled between the gaps in the leather wrap and cast shifting patterns across the bakery walls. Through the burning, she felt him. Not a vague presence this time. Callan, his mind pressing against hers with a force that left her gasping. Rage. Terror. And beneath both, a love so vast that Soriel's composure finally shattered. She bent over her belly and wept. And far to the south, on a road that wound through the western foothills, a massive black wolf lifted its head, its golden eyes blazing, and changed direction toward the coast. He had felt her. He was running. The attack came at dusk. Soriel had spent the afternoon arguing with Thormund about routes. He wanted to take her south immediately, to meet Callan on the road where his wolves could provide protection. She wanted to wait until nightfall, when the fishing boats returned and Dalla could be warned. They were still arguing when the first arrow punched through the bakery's front window and embedded itself in the wall, 6 inches from Soriel's head. The shaft was black. The fletching was stripped of color. And the tip glistened with a dark, oily substance that Soriel's healer instincts identified before her conscious mind caught up. Night vein. A poison distilled from cave fungus that stopped the heart in under a minute. Down! Thormund roared. He seized Soriel's arm and hauled her below the window line as a second arrow shattered the glass above them. The 2 soldiers burst through the back door, already mid-shift, their bodies twisting into wolf form as they leapt into the fading light. The cellar, Thormund commanded. There is a passage beneath the smokehouse. How do you know that? I spent 3 days mapping this village before I knocked on your door. Go. A howl of pain tore through the air outside, one of the soldiers. Then silence. Thormund's face went rigid. Move, my lady. Soriel grabbed the trapdoor ring, but before she could pull, the back wall of the bakery exploded inward. 3 wolves poured through the gap, dark-furred and coordinated with the mechanical precision of trained killers. Thormund shifted instantly. His wolf form was lean and silver-pale, smaller than the attackers but faster. He met the first assassin mid-leap, but there were 3 of them and 1 of him. The second assassin cut off her path to the cellar. The third crashed through the front door, and behind it stepped a hooded man with a recurve bow. Another night vein arrow knocked. The Saranthal send their regards, he said, raising the bow toward Soriel's chest. Thormund, locked in combat with the lead assassin, could not reach her. The second wolf crouched between her and every exit. The archer's fingers tightened on the string. Soriel had no weapon. No escape. No time. She had only the warmth. It rose from somewhere deeper than instinct, deeper than thought, from the place where her grandmother's gift had slept for 26 years, stirring only in moments of mortal need. It flooded her palms, her arms, her chest, a golden heat that was nothing like the burn of the mark, and everything like the feeling of pulling bread from a perfect oven, that rush of creation, of something raw, becoming something whole. Soriel did not think. She pressed her glowing palms together and pushed outward. The light that poured from her hands was not gentle. It was not the soft warmth she had used to mend a horse's leg in a quiet stable. This was a detonation, a wave of golden force that blasted through the ruined bakery like a sunrise compressed into a single heartbeat. The archer was thrown backward through the doorframe. His bow snapped. His body struck the cobblestones 20 feet away and did not rise. The two assassin wolves yelped and scrambled, their fur smoking where the light had touched them. One fled through the shattered back wall. The other turned to follow, then stopped. It looked at Soriel. Its scarred muzzle curled back from teeth still wet with the soldier's blood. And it lunged. Soriel's power was already draining. The blast had cost her more than she had realized, and her vision was beginning to blur at the edges. She raised her hands again, but the light that came was thin, flickering, barely enough to warm her own skin. The wolf's jaws opened wide enough to take her throat. Thormund hit it from the side like a silver missile. The impact sent both wolves tumbling across the flour-dusted floor. They fought with a viciousness that was terrible to watch. Thormund's speed against the assassin's raw mass, blood and fur and fragments of broken furniture flying in every direction. The assassin pinned Thormund against the overturned kneading table. Its jaws found his shoulder and bit down. Thormund howled, a sound of agony that cut through Soriel like a blade. She was on her knees beside him before she knew she had moved. Her hands found the wound, and what little power remained in her poured into the first shield's torn flesh. Not enough to heal completely, enough to stop the bleeding, enough to buy him seconds. Thormund surged upward with renewed strength, his jaws closing around the assassin's throat. The dark wolf thrashed once, twice, then went still. Silence fell over the ruined bakery. Thormund shifted back to human form, clutching his shoulder where the wound still seeped. His face was gray with pain. "How many more?" Soriel demanded. "I do not know. Contracted killers work in cells. There could be a second team." Soriel looked at the destruction around her. The bakery her grandmother had built was gone. Flour and blood covered every surface. The oven itself had cracked from the force of her blast. Her hands were still glowing faintly. She stared at them. "You are more than a healer," Thormund said quietly. "The old texts call it the Forge Gift, the ability to create and destroy in equal measure. It has not appeared in a common blood wolf in over 300 years." Before Soriel could respond, her mark ignited with a heat that made the earlier flares feel like candlelight. She gasped, clutching her wrist, and through the searing pain she felt the bond snap taut, like a rope pulled to its breaking point. He was close. Not days away, not hours, minutes. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The cliff face split apart. Soriel heard it before she saw it. A sound like thunder compressed into a single point, followed by the crack of rock splitting along ancient fault lines. The western bluff above Dunhallow, a wall of limestone that had stood for 10,000 years, broke apart as something enormous came through it. Not over it, not around it, through it. The wolf that emerged from the cascade of falling stone was black as a moonless sea, larger than any wolf Soriel had ever seen. Its eyes burned gold, not amber, not yellow. Gold, like molten metal poured into living sockets. It crossed the distance to the village in 6 impossible strides, and when it reached the ruins of the bakery, those burning eyes found Soriel through the broken wall. She could not move, could not speak, could only stand in the wreckage with flour in her hair and blood on her apron, staring at the creature that contained the man she had loved and lost and tried to stop loving and failed. The wolf stepped through the broken wall with a delicacy absurd for its size, its great paws picking around the debris as if afraid of disturbing the space that had belonged to her. It stopped 2 feet away, and then it lowered its great head and pressed its nose to her belly. Both babies kicked, hard, simultaneously, a double impact that made Soriel gasp and the wolf make a sound she had never heard from any animal, a low, broken whine that vibrated with frequencies that bypassed her ears and landed directly in her chest. "Callan," she whispered. The shift was instantaneous. One heartbeat, a wolf. The next, a man on his knees before her, his hands hovering over her stomach as if the curve of it were something sacred and fragile and terrifying all at once. He looked up at her, and Soriel saw the ruin of 4 months carved into every line of his face. He was gaunt. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes sunken into shadows so deep they looked like bruises. His dark hair was longer than she had ever seen it, tangled and matted from days of running in wolf form. His hands trembled. The Alpha King of Cathara was trembling. "You are alive," he said. His voice was destroyed, shredded, as if he had been howling for months and had nothing left. "You are alive? And you are—" His gaze dropped to her belly again. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. "May I touch them?" he asked. The Alpha King, asking permission. Soriel took his shaking hand and pressed it flat against her stomach. The twins surged into motion, kicks and rolls and what felt like somersaults, both of them responding to their father's touch with a fervor that bordered on frenzy. Callan's palm flattened, then moved, chasing the movements with an expression of such naked wonder that Soriel's carefully constructed walls began to crack. "Two," he breathed. "Soriel, there are two." "Yes. Twins. True mate twins. You carry—" His voice broke completely. He pressed his forehead against her belly and his shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs. Soriel stood above him with her hand on the back of his head and felt the cracks in her walls widen into fissures. Then she stepped back. Callan looked up, stricken. "No," she said. The word came out jagged, torn from a wound that had never closed. "You do not get to kneel here and weep as if you are the one who suffered. You do not get to touch them as if you earned it. Soriel, I was there." Her voice rose and she could not stop it. "I stood in your courtyard with flour on my hands and your child in my belly, and I watched you choose her. I watched you take her hand. I watched you stand on that terrace and declare her your consort while I knelt in the dirt picking up fallen bread." Callan flinched as if she had struck him across the face. "Do you know what I did after that?" Soriel continued, the words pouring out like water through a broken dam. "I delivered the bread. I walked into the stables and I stacked the loaves, and I smiled at the grooms and I walked home. Because what else could I do? I was nobody. I was the girl who never looked up. And you had just proven that I was right to keep my head down. Because looking up, looking at you, loving you, had destroyed me. I was drugged." Callan rose to his feet, and the anguish in his voice was so raw it scraped against her like rough stone. "Thormund told you. The moon's bane. I know what Thormund told me." Tears streaked through the flower dust on her cheeks. "And I want to believe it. I want to believe it so badly that it terrifies me, because if I let myself believe and it turns out to be a lie, I will not survive it a second time." Callan closed the distance between them in a single stride. His hands cupped her face, tilting it up, forcing her to meet his gaze. His golden eyes were wet, red-rimmed, burning with an intensity that was almost too much to bear. "Then feel it," he said fiercely. "Stop listening to words and feel the bond. You know I cannot lie through the mark. You have always known." His thumb brushed the leather wrap on her wrist. Gently, as if handling something infinitely precious, he loosened the binding and let it fall away. Amber light blazed from the crescent of teeth marks, and with it came a flood of sensation so overwhelming that Soriel's knees buckled. Callan caught her, his arms wrapping around her, holding her upright as the bond roared open between them. She felt everything. His terror on the morning he woke with no memory and a stranger in his bed. The frantic sprint through rain-soaked streets, following a scent that grew fainter with every passing second until the rain swallowed it entirely. The months of searching, the villages, the false leads, the sleepless nights while his wolf clawed at the inside of his skull, demanding to run, demanding to find her. And she felt beneath all the pain and rage and anguish the bedrock truth that he had never once wavered from. He loved her, not the way kings loved useful alliances, not the way men loved convenient pleasures. He loved her the way bread loved fire, the way dough loved the patience of rising, the way a song loved the voice that carried it, completely, structurally, as if the removal of her would cause him to collapse into something that no longer resembled himself. Soriel's resistance broke. She grabbed the front of his shirt and pulled him down and kissed him with 4 months of grief and fury and longing compressed into a single, devastating point of contact. The bond detonated. Golden light flooded from both of them, his mark and hers flaring in unison, a matched pulse that sent ripples of warmth radiating outward through the ruined bakery, through the village, through the cliffs and the sea and the darkening sky. Every wolf in Dunhallow lifted its head. Every wolf in the king's approaching army stopped mid-stride. When they finally broke apart, both gasping, Callan pressed his forehead to hers. "I have not touched Revka," he said quietly. "I have not spoken to her. I have not been in the same room with her since the morning I woke. The consort right is void. It was always void. The Saranthals will not accept that. The Saranthals will answer for what they have done." His hand moved to her belly, cradling the curve where his children grew. "They tried to take my will. They tried to take my mate. And now they have tried to take my children." His eyes hardened to molten gold. There is no version of this story where they survive what comes next. A howl rose from the cliffs, then another. Dozens of voices joining a chorus that rolled across the coastal village like thunder. Thormund appeared in the doorway, still clutching his wounded shoulder, his face pale but resolute. "My king, the army is assembling on the southern ridge, all of them." Callan looked at Soriel. His hand had not left her belly. "Come home with me," he said. Not a command, a plea. Soriel looked at the ruins of her bakery, the cracked oven, the scattered flour, the bread she would never bake in this place again. Then she looked at the man who had torn his kingdom apart to kneel before her in the wreckage. "Together," she said. Callan's eyes burned. Together. They rode through the night. Callan had refused to let her out of arm's reach. He lifted her onto his horse before she could protest, settled in behind her, and wrapped one arm around her waist with a possessiveness that should have irritated her, and instead made something deep inside her chest finally unclench. The twins seemed to agree. For the first time in weeks, they settled into stillness, their frantic kicking replaced by a quiet warmth that spread through Soriel's belly like sunlight through bread dough. "They know you," she said softly, resting her hand over his where it cradled her stomach. "They knew me before I arrived." Callan's voice was rough against her hair. "I felt them through the bond. 2 presences, not one. I did not understand what it meant until now." He told her everything as they rode, details the bond had shown her in fragments, waking to find Revka in his chambers, the horror of the consort ring on his hand, throwing her out when he realized what had been done. But hearing it spoken aloud in his broken voice made it real in a way the bond's raw emotion had not. He told her about standing in her empty bakery after the rain washed away her scent, his hands on her kneading table, breathing in the last traces of flour and rosemary. "I kept a piece of the bread," he said quietly. "The last loaf you delivered. Thormund showed me. It sounds like madness. It sounds like you." Soriel turned her head to look at him. The relief of finding her had loosened whatever iron will had been holding him upright, and exhaustion was flooding into every line of his face. She reached up and touched his face. His eyes closed, and he leaned into her palm with a shudder. "I dreamed of you," she said. "Every night. You came to the bakery and told me you were coming." Callan's eyes opened. "Those were not dreams. My wolf, when I finally slept, he reached for you through the bond. I did not know if it was working. I did not know if you could hear." "I heard." Her thumb traced the hollow of his cheek. "I thought I was going mad." "We were both going mad." He caught her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. "Separately, when we should have been going mad together." Despite everything, Soriel laughed. It was a small sound, fragile and unexpected, and it surprised them both. Callan stared at her as if the laugh were a miracle, and then something in his face softened in a way that made her heart ache. "I missed that," he whispered. "I missed every part of you, but I missed that sound most of all." They rode in silence for a while after that, the army of wolves flowing around them like a dark river. Soriel leaned back against Callan's chest and let herself feel, for the first time in 4 months, something that was not grief or fear or the exhausting effort of pretending to be someone she was not. She felt safe. Dawn was breaking when they crested the last hill, and the capital spread before them. Cathara was as familiar to Soriel as her own hands, but the city she was looking at was not the city she had left. Smoke rose from the eastern quarter. The great market, visible even from this distance, was shuttered and dark. The crimson banners of the crown that should have flown from every gatehouse had been replaced by the silver and black of House Saranthal. And above the palace itself, mounted on the highest tower where the king's standard had flown for 12 generations, hung the Saranthal crest, a coiled serpent devouring its own tail. "No!" Callan breathed behind her. Thormund rode up beside them, his face ashen. "They have taken the city." "When?" Callan's voice was ice. "It must have been within the last 2 days, while we were in Dunhallow." The first shield's jaw tightened. "We left the council regent in your absence, my king. Lord Saranthal must have used the opening." A scout came galloping from the tree line. "My king, the Saranthals struck at dawn yesterday. Lord Aldrin has declared the consort right legitimate and named Revka as ruling queen. He claims you have gone feral and abandoned the throne." The scout's voice faltered. "They have taken hostages. 43 members of the household who refused to swear loyalty. They are to be executed at sundown." Soriel's blood went cold. "The stable hands too?" "All of them, my lady, including the old groom master." Haddon. The name hit Soriel like a fist. Old Haddon, who had let her use his fire on cold mornings, who had found her crying in the hayloft the night Callan first kissed her, and had said nothing, only handed her his handkerchief, and walked away with a knowing smile. "They will execute them at sundown," the scout continued. Callan's arm tightened around Soriel. "We will not let that happen." "You cannot storm the palace before sundown," Thormund said carefully. "The walls are designed to withstand a siege of months, not hours." "I do not need months." Callan's eyes flared gold. "I need my mate, my wolves, and one open gate." Soriel placed her hand over his. "Haddon protected me. The stable hands fed your horse and kept our secret. 43 people are going to die because they were loyal to you." "I know." "Then we go now." Callan looked down at her. "You are carrying our children, Soriel. I will not bring you into a battle. You will not leave me behind again." She held his gaze with a steadiness that surprised them both. "The last time you left me behind, I spent 4 months believing you had thrown me away. I will not wait in safety while people die for the crime of being kind to me." For a long moment the Alpha King said nothing. Then he pressed his lips to her temple. "My stubborn, impossible baker." He turned to the army assembled behind them. "The Saranthals believe they have won. They sit on a stolen throne behind stolen walls and call themselves the rightful rulers of Cathara." His voice carried across the ridge like the crack of a blacksmith's hammer. "They are wrong. Today, we show them what happens when wolves bare their teeth at the wrong king. The army howled, hundreds of voices, raw and savage and unified in a fury that shook the ground beneath their feet. And at the head of the column, with his mate held close and his children growing strong beneath his hand, the Alpha King rode toward his city. The battle reached the palace walls within the hour. The outer walls fell in 20 minutes, the inner courtyard in 10. But the Great Hall held. Lord Aldrin Saranthal had barricaded himself inside with the 43 hostages and a personal guard of 200 wolves. The doors were reinforced iron. The windows were arrow slits too narrow for a wolf to pass through. And the message that emerged, delivered by a trembling servant who had been sent through a side passage, was exactly what Soriel had feared. Lord Saranthal says that if the king does not surrender himself and submit to exile, the hostages will be executed immediately. He will begin with the old groom master. Callan stood before the sealed doors, his chest heaving, blood from a dozen minor wounds staining his torn clothing. Around him, his wolves circled with barely contained violence, waiting for the command to breach. "We cannot break those doors before he starts killing," Thormund said from behind a makeshift barricade, his wounded shoulder bound in strips torn from his own shirt. "Not in time. There is another way in," Soriel said. Every head turned toward her. She stood at the edge of the courtyard, one hand on her belly, the other pressed against the ancient stone wall of the great hall. Her eyes were closed, and the faintest trace of golden light leaked between her fingers where they touched the rock. "The bread passage," she said, "beneath the kitchens. I used it every morning to deliver loaves to the great hall's serving pantry. It opens behind the tapestry on the eastern wall." Thormund's eyes widened. That passage was sealed 20 years ago. The door was sealed. The tunnel was not. Soriel opened her eyes. "I know because I repaired the door's hinges myself when I was 16. The old groom master showed me the passage so I could make deliveries without crossing the main hall during state functions." Callan was already moving toward her. "Show me the entrance. I will go through alone." "You will not fit." Soriel met his gaze. The passage was built for servants carrying bread trays, not for an Alpha King in full battle rage. The ceiling is 5 feet high and the tunnel narrows to 3 feet at the midpoint. "Then I will shift and—" "A wolf your size will not fit either." Soriel's voice was calm, terrifyingly calm. "But I will." The silence that followed was absolute. "No," Callan said. The word was not a command. It was a desperate, ragged denial. "Absolutely not. Listen to me." Soriel took his hand and placed it on her belly, where the twins kicked in agitation. "Aldrin Saranthal has 200 wolves and 43 hostages behind those doors. If you breach, he kills them. If you surrender, he kills you, and then he kills them, and then he kills me and our children. The only option that saves everyone is someone on the inside. You are 7 months pregnant. I am 7 months pregnant. I know every inch of that passage, and I have a gift that just threw a professional assassin through a stone wall." She squeezed his hand. "I am not the girl who kept her head down anymore, Callan. You asked me once why I never looked at you. I was afraid of being seen. I am not afraid anymore." Callan's jaw worked. His eyes burned with the war between his wolf's primal need to protect his mate and his king's recognition that she was right. "What will you do once you are inside?" he asked, his voice barely controlled. "I will get to the hostages. I will open the doors from within." She held his gaze. "And you will be ready when I do. If anything happens to you, then you will have to bake your own bread." The ghost of a smile crossed her face. "And we both know how that would end." It was the wrong moment for humor. It was exactly the right moment for humor. Callan made a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and he pulled her against him with a force that pressed the twins between them. "You come back to me," he said against her hair. "Swear it on the mark." Soriel pressed her wrist to his chest. The mark glowed amber between them. "I swear," she said. "On the mark. On the bread. On every morning I walked into those stables and pretended not to see you watching me from the window." He kissed her. Hard. Fast. The kind of kiss that was not a goodbye, but a demand for continuation. Then Soriel turned and walked toward the kitchen passage that she had used 1,000 times to deliver bread and would now use to save 43 lives. Callan watched her go. His hands were shaking. His wolf was screaming. And for the first time since the morning he woke from the moonspain, the Alpha King was afraid. The bread passage was exactly as Soriel remembered. Low-ceilinged, narrow, smelling of old flour and damp stone. She moved through it with practiced ease, one hand trailing along the wall for guidance, the other cradling her belly as she navigated the tight turns. The twins were restless, their movements sharp and urgent, as if they sensed the danger their mother was walking into. The passage opened into the serving pantry behind a heavy wooden door that groaned on the hinges she had repaired a decade ago. Soriel eased it open an inch and pressed her eye to the gap. The Great Hall of Cathera was a nightmare. 43 hostages knelt in 2 rows down the center of the hall, their hands bound behind their backs with iron cord. Saranthal soldiers stood behind them with blades drawn, one for each prisoner. On the dais where Callan should have sat, Lord Aldrin Saranthal presided from the throne with the rigid posture of a man who knew he was sitting in a seat that did not belong to him. And beside him, wearing a crown that had not been offered, stood Revka. Soriel found Haddon in the second row. The old groom master's face was bloodied but defiant, his chin raised, his eyes steady. When a guard shoved his shoulder to force his head down, Haddon simply raised it again. Soriel's heart clenched, then steadied. She pushed the pantry door open and stepped into the great hall. For a moment no one noticed her. She was a pregnant woman in a flour-dusted dress, emerging from a servant's entrance. She was, in every visible respect, exactly what she had always pretended to be. Nobody. She made it halfway across the hall before Revka's voice cut through the tension like a whip. "Stop her!" 2 guards converged on Soriel immediately, seizing her arms. She did not resist. Lord Saranthal leaned forward on the stolen throne, his eyes narrowing. "And who is this?" "The baker." Revka descended from the dais, her dark wine hair catching the torchlight. "The one who delivered bread to the stables. The one Callan has been tearing the kingdom apart to find." Her lip curled. "The one carrying his illegitimate offspring." A murmur rippled through the Saranthal soldiers. The hostages shifted, and Soriel saw Haddon's eyes widen with recognition and immediate terror. "No," the old groom master breathed. "Girl, what have you done?" Soriel ignored him. Her gaze was fixed on Lord Saranthal. "You want the king to surrender?" she said. "I am offering you something worth more than his surrender." Saranthal's eyebrow rose. "Go on?" "Me, his mate, his unborn heirs." Soriel's voice carried across the silent hall with a clarity that surprised even her. "Release the hostages, all 43. Let them walk out the front doors unharmed, and I will remain as your prisoner." "Soriel, no!" Haddon's shout was cut short by a guard's fist. Lord Saranthal studied her with the cold calculation of a man weighing flesh against leverage. "A generous offer. But why should I trade 43 commoners for 1 baker's daughter?" "Because 43 commoners give you nothing. The Alpha King's mate and children give you everything. Control over the succession. Leverage over Callan. A hostage he will never sacrifice, no matter the cost." Revka stepped forward. "Father, kill her now. She is a threat as long as she breathes." "Silence, daughter." Sorenthal's eyes had not left Soriel's. "The girl speaks sense." He waved a hand. "Release the prisoners, secure the baker." The hostages were cut free one by one. Soriel watched them stumble toward the doors, dazed and bleeding. Haddon tried to reach her, but soldiers pushed him toward the exit with the others. "Run!" Soriel mouthed to him. "Tell him I am here." The great doors opened, and the hostages poured into the courtyard. Soriel heard the distant sound of Callan's wolves receiving them, and through the bond she felt his confusion, his rising dread, his sudden terrible understanding of what she had done. The doors slammed shut. Soriel stood alone in the great hall, surrounded by 200 Saranthal wolves and the two people who had orchestrated every moment of her suffering. "Now then," Revka said, circling her. "The baker who stole my crown. You should have stayed hidden." "And you should have used more moonsbane," Soriel replied. "Clearly the first dose was not strong enough to make him actually want you." Revka's hand connected with Soriel's face hard enough to snap her head sideways. Soriel tasted blood. "My father will use you to bring Callan to his knees," Revka hissed. "And when the kingdom is secured and the bloodline is ours, I will personally ensure that neither you nor your mongrel children survive to tell anyone the truth." The mark on Soriel's wrist pulsed. Through the bond, she felt Callan's wolf tear free of his control. She had seconds. "There is something you should know about my children," Soriel said, straightening to face Revka with blood on her lip and fire in her eyes. "And what is that?" "They are awake." The golden light did not come from Soriel's hands this time. It came from everywhere. From her belly, where two unborn children blazed with the combined power of a true mate bond that had not existed in the royal bloodline for 5 generations. From her wrist, where the claiming mark ignited like a star gone nova. From the very stones of the Great Hall, which had been built by the founding pack and still remembered the frequency of genuine royal blood. The light was blinding. Saranthal soldiers stumbled backward, shielding their eyes. Revka screamed, her hands flying to her face. And inside the light, Soriel's body began to change. She had felt the wolf stirring for weeks. Small movements in her bones, shifts in her senses that she had attributed to pregnancy. But this was not a stirring. This was an eruption. 4 months of suppressed transformation, held back by fear and grief, and the relentless need to remain invisible, demanding release all at once. Pain ripped through her. Bones cracked and rebuilt, muscles tore and reformed with a strength she had never possessed. Her scream became a howl, became a roar of something ancient and enormous and furious beyond language. Lord Saranthal drew his sword, a blade that gleamed with the sickly iridescence of moonsbane coating, and brought it down toward the shifting mass of light and fur that had been a pregnant baker moments before. The blade stopped. Soriel's jaws held the sword 6 inches from her own skull. Not her hands. Her jaws. Because where a woman had stood, a wolf now crouched. And this wolf was unlike anything that had existed in Cathara for 300 years. Her fur was the color of raw gold. Not silver, not white, not any shade that existed in the known bloodlines. Gold, like bread crust, like morning sunlight through bakery windows, like the light that lived in her healing hands made manifest across her entire body. She was the forge wolf, the creator and destroyer, the gift made flesh. And she was done hiding. Soriel wrenched the moonsbane blade from Saranthal's grip and flung it across the hall. The old lord stumbled backward, his composure finally cracking. The great doors exploded inward for the 2nd time that day. Callan's wolf filled the entrance like a shadow made solid, black against the golden light that radiated from his mate. He took in the scene in an instant, Soriel in wolf form, Saranthal retreating, Revka cowering, 200 soldiers frozen with indecision. He did not hesitate. The Alpha King's wolves poured through the ruined doors like a dark tide. The Saranthal soldiers, already rattled by Soriel's transformation, broke ranks. Some fought. Most dropped their weapons and pressed themselves against the walls in submission. Lord Saranthal seized a fallen guard's crossbow and fired at Soriel. Callan intercepted the bolt with his own shoulder, snarling with pain as the moonsbane tip bit into his flesh. He crushed the crossbow in his jaws and drove Saranthal backward against the throne, pinning him to the seat he had stolen. Soriel shifted back to human form. The transformation was smooth this time, controlled, as if her body had finally accepted what it was meant to be. She stood in the center of the great hall, one hand on her belly, golden light still flickering across her skin. Revka had retrieved a knife. She advanced toward Soriel from the side, her face twisted with wild fury. "You are nothing," Revka spat. "A baker. A servant. A girl who could not even look the king in the eye." "I was everything," Soriel replied quietly. "You just could not see it. Neither could I for a long time. But he could. He saw me every morning for 2 years before he ever spoke a word. And when he finally asked why I never looked at him, it was because he had been looking at me the entire time." Revka lunged with the knife. Soriel caught her wrist. The forge gift flared in her palm, not violent this time, not destructive. Something more precise. She held the blade inches from her own chest and poured warmth into Revka's hand until the metal grew too hot to hold. The knife clattered to the stones. Revka sank to her knees, cradling her burned hand, and for the first time, the false queen of Cathara looked up at the true one with something that was not contempt. It was fear. Callan shifted back to human form, blood running from his moonsbane wound. He crossed to Soriel and took her face in his hands. "Are you hurt?" "No." She placed her hand over the bolt wound on his shoulder, and golden warmth flowed from her palm into his flesh. The poison neutralized. The wound closed. He shuddered with relief. "You shifted," he breathed. "Soriel, you are gold. Apparently, I have been hiding more than I knew." He pulled her against him, his forehead pressed to hers, his body shaking with the aftermath of battle and terror, and the overwhelming reality that she was alive and whole, and standing before him in the hall, where his ancestors had ruled for 12 generations. "Claim me," he said, "here, now, in front of all of them. Complete the bond, so that no Saranthal, no council, no power in this kingdom or any other can ever separate us again." Soriel looked into his golden eyes. She thought of the morning she had first walked into the royal stables with bread in her arms and her gaze fixed on the ground. She thought of the girl who had been so afraid of being seen that she had made herself invisible. That girl was gone. Soriel pressed her lips to the place where his neck met his shoulder. She felt his pulse racing beneath her mouth. She felt the bond straining toward completion, two halves of a single thread reaching for each other across the gap that had separated them for too long. Her teeth broke his skin. The bond completed. It was not an explosion this time. It was a rising, like bread in a warm oven, like dough expanding into its final shape. Slow and inevitable and perfect. His memories poured into her and hers into him, and for one shimmering, eternal moment, they saw themselves through each other's eyes. He saw the girl who kept her head down, who baked bread in the dark, who healed a horse and looked up to find a king staring at her, and felt, for the first time in her life, the terrifying possibility of being known. He saw her strength, her stubbornness, her quiet, relentless courage. He saw the woman who had walked into an enemy stronghold 7 months pregnant and bargained her own life for 43 strangers because she could not bear the thought of anyone else suffering for her sake. She saw the boy who became king too young, who walked through his own stables every morning pretending to check his horses and really watching for the baker's daughter who never looked up. She saw the man who carried a piece of stale bread in his pocket because it was the closest he could get to holding her, who tore his kingdom apart not because he was mad, but because he was incomplete, and the missing piece of him had vanished into the rain. When Soriel released him, they were both weeping. "My queen," Callan said. "My king," she answered. And in the great hall of Cathara, surrounded by defeated enemies and loyal wolves, and the echoes of a battle that had finally ended, the Alpha King and his baker pressed their foreheads together and breathed. The Saranthals faced judgment before the assembled packs of Cathara on the first day of summer. Lord Aldrin was stripped of his titles, his lands, and his wolf. The Moonsbane compound that his house had cultivated in secret for decades was destroyed. Every root and seed and vial burned in a pyre that the entire kingdom watched. He was exiled to the salt flats beyond the eastern border, where nothing grew and no pack would shelter him. Revka was given a choice: exile or execution. She chose exile. As she was led from the great hall in chains, she glanced at the claiming mark on the new queen's wrist, and something in her expression shifted from hatred to a grief that might have been the first stirring of understanding that some things could not be stolen because they were never possessions to begin with. The kingdom healed. Slowly, the way all true healing does. The crops pushed green shoots through damaged soil. The herds returned. The wild wolves settled back into the rhythms of territory and season. Soriel did not stop baking. This was the detail that surprised the kingdom most. The new queen, the woman who carried the forge gift and had shifted into a golden wolf in the middle of the great hall, continued to rise before dawn, knead dough with her own hands, and produce bread that the palace staff swore was the finest in 3 territories. She baked in the royal kitchens now, not in a cramped bakery on the market's edge. The ovens were larger, the flour was finer, but she still sang to the dough while it rose, because her grandmother had sworn it made the crust better, and Soriel had never found reason to doubt her grandmother about anything. Callan watched her bake the way he had always watched her, from a doorway, leaning against the frame, unable to keep the wonder from his face. "You could have the bakers do this," he said one morning, 6 weeks after the battle, as she shaped loaves with flour-dusted fingers. "I could. But then, who would sing to the dough? I am certain the royal bakers know songs. They do not know my grandmother's songs." She looked up at him and smiled. "Besides, if I stopped baking, what would you carry in your pocket?" He laughed. It was a sound she had not heard in months, and it filled the kitchen like warmth from an open oven. On a morning in late summer, when the palace gardens were heavy with the scent of lavender and the sun poured through the kitchen windows in wide golden bands, Soriel gave birth to twins. A boy, dark-haired like his father, who opened his eyes and looked at the world with a calm amber gaze that seemed to take in everything and judge nothing. And a girl, born howling, whose tiny fists glowed with faint golden light that faded slowly as Soriel held her against her chest and hummed the rising song. Callan held his son in arms that could break iron and cradled him as if he were made of breath and starlight. Tears ran freely down the Alpha King's face, and he made no effort to hide them. "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking, "for coming back, for fighting, for not giving up on us when I gave you every reason to." Soriel reached up and touched the claiming mark on his throat. Silver now, healed into a scar that matched the one on her wrist, both of them permanent testaments to a bond that had survived poison and betrayal and 4 months of separation and the relentless, grinding pressure of a world that had tried in every conceivable way to keep them apart. "You asked me once why I never looked at you," she said softly. "I was afraid that if I did, you would see everything I was trying to hide." Callan leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead. "I saw it anyway," he said. "Every morning. Every single morning." Outside the kitchen window, the wolves of Cathara lifted their voices in a howl of celebration that rolled across the city and out over the fields and forests, and all the way to the northern coast, where a fishing village called Dunhallow paused in its work and listened and smiled without quite knowing why. And in the royal kitchens, beside an oven that smelled of rosemary and oat, A queen held her children while a king held her, and the bread rose golden in the warmth. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story.